Kia ora, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome back to Citizen Aid, where we wrap the week's current affairs with the best political team on television from a very, very Auckland perspective. Warning, we're as fair and balanced as Fox News. Joining me tonight on a revolving panel of bloggers and Auckland opinion shapers. He is the editor of independent news site livenews.co.nz, the ever-brilliant Selwyn Manning. And she is from the Auckland University Department of Film, TV and Media Studies, blogger and commentator Phoebe Fletcher. Coming up tonight, Issue 1, Trouble at Port, the union-busting actions of the ports of Auckland. Is sound economics or political manoeuvring to privatise? Issue 2, Public Broadcasting. Is New Zealand on air more concerned with keeping New Zealand off air in light of their criticism of TV3 to broadcast a doco on poverty in the week of the election? Issue 3, the Crown Minerals Act is being replaced to make it easier to mine. Are we ready for more exploration? And in a recession, can we afford not to? And we'll end the show on a final word, but let's kick things off with Issue 1. Muldoon originally wanted condominiums to ruin the Auckland waterfront, and current waterfront property deals so secret the Auckland super city won't even acknowledge they exist reminds us that property developers have always jealously eyed the ports of Auckland, and the ever-present desire to flog off public assets for private benefit seem as prevalent as ever before. Phoebe, does this dispute represent the new low-wage economy the government were boasting about?
I don't know if it represents a new low-wage economy that the government were boasting about, because this is certainly something that I think is coming from management.
Yep.
And that, you know, this was really clearly a call to try and casualise the workforce. We've had the leaked documents that prove that this was something that they were planning to do all along. We have had a quite effective, I would say, public relations campaign where they have said things like Fonterra going to Napier was something that was caused by the union when they were clearly in discussion for the last 2 years. So I think this is an attempt to break the union, and this is an attempt to casualise the workforce.
There shouldn't be any pretense about it, should there? This is about busting unionised labour.
I don't think that there is that much pretense about it, to be honest. I think, but on the other hand, I don't know that the union are kind of winning the public media war here. I think this has been a quite effective campaign in the way that it's been run.
Selwyn, Rod Oram highlights the point from the Productivity Commission report that it isn't port productivity via union-busting measures that needs investigating. It is the freight charges shipping lines are charging us that demands the greatest scrutiny for us to remain competitive with Australia. By ignoring this point, is Ports of Auckland manufacturing a crisis to justify privatisation?
Yeah, I think that it's being manufactured. We can see, let's look at why. I think in your intro you hit on a few interesting things. That there has been a long-term want to actually, for many with vested interest, private invested interest, to take possession of that part of Auckland. At the moment, it's basically people look out at that and they see industry. They see containers, they see container ships coming in. What they do not see is the livelihoods of many who rely on that. If you take that, then I think to answer the why is there's an underlying strategy for those like private interests to acquire it.
Yes.
Now, if you remember back, Matthew Hooton, who's National Party connected, skilled strategist, he mentioned on this show back in late September.
That's correct.
That there was a move that he would support to move the ports of Auckland up to Marsden Point.
That's right. And Tauranga.
To develop deep sea port at Marsden Point and Tauranga, and to wipe it out of the Auckland area. Now that was 2 months before we started to actually see the national-led government starting to sow in information that would discredit any of those that would oppose that type of strategy. Not saying that it's gospel, but that's what we have heard is underlying this whole issue.
That's right.
And it may answer the question of why.
Phoebe, put into perspective, the equivalence of Labour's spectacular silence on the Ports of Auckland union-crushing agenda would be National having nothing to say about implementing every single word of Karl Marx's economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844 within a 1-month policy rolled out, codenamed Kill the Filthy Farmer. Why is David Shearer so silent?
I don't think he should be, to be
But
honest.
why
I
is he?
agree.
Why is he so
well,
silent?
because I think that he is trying to play to the centre, isn't he? You know, that we've got this notion that there's David Shearer who's come in, he's backed by the right. Obviously, a lot of those interests that you were just talking about are ones that were supportive of Shearer's nomination. But I think that you know, he is very wary of getting into the middle of this dispute, and there's this notion, and I mean, this is reflected among some, that politicians shouldn't be in a local body dispute. However, I do think that this is Labor's traditional stomping ground, and in order for Shearer to come out strong, he should have something to say about it.
Is there silence deafening?
No, what I think on that too is that it's early days for Shearer, and I think that what we're seeing is a politician who's gone through into the leadership that is used to seeing others in his caucus take the lead on particular issues. We know that Shearer does not come from a faction where the union is dominating.
That's right.
He has the support of that faction, but he isn't a part of it. He is instinctually, I think, sitting back and hesitating, waiting for those people, those members of the caucus in the Labour Party, to come forward that are unionists and actually do something here. But he can't. You know, these people in the union movement, most of them, have sat on their hands for the last 3 years doing nothing. There's an inertia about them, and they've got to get off their hands and actually do something and support.
You know, him not saying anything has actually pushed some of the others that are more union faction to actually not say anything as well. I mean, Darian Fenton, she did a blog where she very much kind of skirted around.
That's right.
issues.
Right.
But they are there to actually represent the interests of the working person. That's why they're in the Labour Party. They cannot wait. You know, it's they've got a mandate to speak. You know, people have had a guts full of the union plants in the Labour Party sitting there doing nothing. You know, that's why the Unite Union was created, for example, to actually give true independent representation to the working person. And that's why it became very popular and supported by many. You know, Labour MPs need to wake up and make this a watershed year for them and to get out there and actually do their job.
Is the sense then with which the right has managed to promote disinformation about the wages of wharfies further proof that the union movement has to update their media responsibilities? I mean, these proposals will see wharfies earning $20,000 a year less, yet the misperception that they all earn just under $100,000 doesn't provoke much public sympathy.
No.
Have the unions underestimated the intentions of Port?
I think that the union movement needs to reconnect with mainstream media's journalists, and I know there are few on the ground these days, but I think that the union movement, by and large, has relied for the last, say, 4 or 5 years on bloggers like yourselves, who are connected to those types of ideals to do the hard work for them. Well, I'm sorry, mainstream is very, very influential, like we all know and complain about in this country. And the union movement needs to connect to that. We have a dominance within the mainstream media of right-leaning kind of individuals here. Now, to counter that, you've got to have good, solid, personable contacts. And you have to be able to talk.
What have the union done wrong? What have they done wrong?
I just want to cut in here because I think that making the debate about wages rather than about casualisation, safety, being able to plan your roster and so on has obviously worked against the union. And that $91,000 figure, I spent quite a long time, like others have at the Standard. There's been this ongoing debate about how do we figure out how they got to that figure. Well, you know, it appears to have first come from Cactus Kate, and it was emailed to her by the Ports of Auckland communication manager, Catherine Etheridge. And but I think before that, Tony Gibson was also sort of saying that that was the result for a 26-hour week.
Seeded,
and then that has changed.
Yeah.
But it appears to have come from an advertisement in November last year. And I mean, this is really difficult ground for the union to fight, I think, because nobody knows, you know, that information unless there's a kind of independent audit of the company. So it has kind of pushed them into a very difficult ground to fight. And I don't know whether it's necessarily accurate. I think the Herald on Sunday's editorial saying that they still didn't understand how the Ports of Auckland came to the 91k figure really says it all.
That Gibson rumoured at $750,000. That's his pay. And they're looking to make $6 million savings. Surely managers at his level should be making the cuts. Why the workers? I mean, if this is about productivity and cutbacks, why don't they start with him?
Well, it's a very good question. I think from the leaked information, wasn't it, that they were willing to spend $5 million to make those cuts?
But just remember on this whole issue, we're talking, if we're right in seeing, you know, the answer to that why question earlier, that the strategy is to basically break the back of those that will be influential in holding the ports there. The tactics are all about what you're talking about. Seeding in information that may or may not be true, that is going to be at the best, assisting that cause to actually argue that these people have been on a gravy train for a long time, to distance themselves from the fair and reasonably minded New Zealander, and then to actually work on other strategies that would say we're losing the support of all of these companies that have been trading with the ports of Auckland for all this time because of this non-productivity. The only way to provide a solution to that, I would argue, that it'll come in later in the year, is to move the ports somewhere.
That's right.
I think the union are picking up on that.
Yes.
Like if you notice that Parslow, when he was first in the media, he would use the F word and things that you don't do in the media. But they have pulled back their 6th day of strike now to a stop work meeting. So I think that the union are also getting much more media savvy now that they've got people like Helen Kelly from the CTU that are coming in to help.
They need to lift their game, don't they? Both of you. Question to both of you. Cameron Slater blogs the mayor received $2,000 from Maritime Union and spooks Len into siding with the ports of Auckland. How come Slater tricked Len Brown into being his muppet? What happened there? What's Len doing?
I don't think either of those two parties. I don't think Len Brown would want to have Cam's hand up the back and being the
Cam's
puppet master.
congratulating him online.
Well,
congratulating him.
Cam's very, very skilled at being able to show that somebody is following his lead, and particularly if it's a victim of his work.
That's right.
The challenge here is for Len, Glyn Jones, his chief press secretary, to actually either render such arguments irrelevant, to develop their own independent position on this.
Yes.
I'm not saying it's connected to Cam, but and to drive that through, to challenge people at the New Zealand Herald, for example, like Bernard Orsman, to get down and to find out what is really, really at the base of all of this. Yeah. It'll be interesting to see if that's the case. But Len, I think it's one of the biggest challenges that Len faces, and also, there are other issues like the rail issue.
That's right.
That's all linked here. That Len perhaps cannot be the decent politician and coast his way through the next 12 months.
That $2,000 from the Maritime Union, that didn't buy him. That gets lunch maybe with Len. Surely a bigger question would be that almost $500,000 worth of donations that have gone to him in a secret trust. I mean, has Len come out on support of the ports of Auckland because he knows that the privatisation agenda for this is well underway? He's lining himself up, isn't he?
Possibly, or I think, as Selwyn says, maybe he doesn't have a good enough understanding of what's going on. But either way, he needs to really get that rectified as soon as possible.
Thank you, panel. Moving on to issue 2. The debate that has erupted with the release of emails from New Zealand On Air over their self-censorship of a poverty doco that embarrassed the government in the week after the election has raised serious concerns about New Zealand On Air's priorities to political documentaries and the role they themselves see in terms of fulfilling themselves as a public broadcaster. Phoebe, the first issue here is, what is the role of New Zealand On Air supposed to be? Shouldn't a documentary on poverty be played in the week of the election, because that's what a critical media is supposed to do, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, you have to look at the establishment of public broadcasting or a mixed model system like we've got in New Zealand. We can't afford to have a sole public service broadcasting model, so we have part commercial model as well. But, our kind of model of broadcasting was very much based on the principles of Lord Reith, which are to educate, to inform, and to entertain, and the notion that there needed to be a kind of independent fourth estate. Now, New Zealand On Air's role is supposed to be independent. Okay, so you have had their chief executive say that, he is legally bound to be independent. Now, this is something that crosses a line, I feel, because if you think about the issue of the Inside Child Poverty documentary and the emails that were going around people like Jane Wrightson and Stephen McElroy, this is incredibly problematic, the fact that we have an issue that is seen as politically aligned, okay? And, let's face it, okay? National themselves were trying to say that they were going to reduce the poverty cycle by getting people off long-term benefits. This, this notion that it was only an issue after that documentary was screened is just rubbish. I mean, we were talking about it for half of last year.
That's right.
And what, Labour, the Māori Party, Mana, the Greens all had policy that was circulated around child poverty. And so this is an issue that is not owned by one party. And I am incredibly disappointed to see those kind of manoeuvres within New Zealand On Air, and also strong-arming TV3 in terms of a time that they can schedule broadcasting slots. They are not allowed to do that.
So, on the second issue here has to be around political appointees. Most New Zealanders would be shocked to learn John Key's own electorate chairman is on the board of New Zealand On Air, and that he complained first about the screening of the poverty documentary. While political appointees, they're a reality of our system, there has to be a level of meritocracy and objectivity in their appointment, doesn't there?
I strongly agree, Bomber. This whole thing is not just a government appointee. And let's be clear, every party that gets into government has its in the first 2 years, first 3 years, it has got a big job of unpicking all the appointees of the previous government and putting in appointees of their own.
Yeah, we accept that.
But what we're seeing here is a party political appointment.
Yes.
This is the difference. He is not independently connected to the government and then appointed across. He is speaking from a party point of view. We know that right through that period of the election campaign and prior to, the National Party and its leader, who happened to be the Prime Minister, was denying these issues of child poverty and trying to actually explain them away as irrelevant.
That's right.
Even though he campaigned on them. The election was on again.
2008, but that was convenient. This isn't. That appointee that they made here came into bat on a party point of view. In my mind, that is part of a trend that we have been seeing since National Party got into government. Now, don't misunderstand me. Helen Clark was one of the most formidable, and her team in executive office in the Beehive were one of the most formidable adversaries if you as a media went against their view or their will. But this is different. This is a bit more insidious.
This is political censorship.
Yeah, this is a party stooge, in a sense, been appointed to a particular position here that is going to influence whether or not media and Fourth Estate actually even get to make a program. That is where the thing is. And to me, it's like there's a context. We're seeing a slow unpicking of public broadcasting service in this country. It is there for a reason. It's there for a good reason. This is, once again, the question of why these type of things occur that we wouldn't even know of if it wasn't for the good work of Tom Fruin and putting it through Scoop.
That's right.
It's an appalling situation. It needs to be challenged.
Phoebe, suffocating public broadcasting and intimidating corporate media using the police over the Epsom Tea Party tapes seems to be standard practice now. Why should the public care about public broadcasting? Isn't the E channel just more fun?
No, I think it serves a really important role, and especially in an election. And I think that National has shown to some extent a disregard for when things need to be independent bodies. I mean, I'm also thinking of the Human Rights Commission, where John Key chided them over Paula Bennett having a human rights abuse because they were talking about an independent judicial inquiry that was going on into her work. It absolutely must function as a Fourth Estate, and it is crucial in an election that people have the opportunity to hear debate.
It's not overly sensitised. It's the perfect time. It's the time when people need to take stock and think about these issues. The makers of that documentary and TV3 ought to be applauded for that. It wasn't just a nitpicking kind of exercise at the national government here. It looked at the rise of child poverty in New Zealand. It challenged every politician. It challenged all of us to actually seek solutions to this problem. It's an abhorrent. You get some meanly miserable party appointment coming out via sneaky email to the chair of the NZ On Air, trying to make sure that this wouldn't happen in the future.
The Q&A and The Nation are funded by New Zealand On Air and lean heavily to the right and for the status quo. Will these shows be censored for that bias during elections, or is it only shows that embarrass the government that will be censored? Well, how will this work?
If we look at the trend here, I think the ideal from the point of view of the National Party would be able to have a channel where every press statement is read in an interesting way to the desiring public, that any control from the point of view of independence
Yep.
is wheedled away.
Yep.
That it stifles opposition in Parliament. You know,
Yep.
this is the ideal world, and I would suggest that that's not necessarily the bastion of the far right of the National Party,
Yeah.
but ones that was a scourge on the world stage during the Stalinist years.
Yeah.
You know, that's why we have a fourth estate to independently
Question
kind
of both of
challenge
you
this.
then. 3 years of the mainstream media claiming National were over 50% led to a level of apathy that saw the lowest voter turnout in 120 years. With Stratos off air and TVNZ 7 about to be sold to a shopping channel, is a detached populace rather than a functioning public broadcaster actually in the interests of a government?
Well, this is, you know, basically, I suppose there is a notion that it suits certain parties when people don't vote. Although I do think that, you know, on the left there were other things going on. I don't think that it's necessarily that people don't get news. I think people are very engaged in the internet. And so on, and that they get information through other vehicles. But I think that this is something that absolutely needs to be nipped in the bud. I think in terms of New Zealand on air, there is always going to be political pressure. I didn't think that child poverty was necessarily an issue against National. I thought it was something that Labor had failed miserably on as well. But I think that the appointees on there need to be people who can handle that pressure from government. They need to be people who are very staunch and able to put up with that level of pressure.
But let's be frank, the criticisms of New Zealand on air over the period, over the years have been that it's those well-heeled old kind of people that have been in control of these things for a long time, looking after the well-heeled people who have been controlled of putting stuff out for so long. You know, the difficulties, for example, for Stratos to actually sustain its presence in a growing market. You know, we've seen the evidence of what happens when New Zealand on air does not actually address these new, independently developing kind of broadcast entities. Closure is the answer to that. New Zealand on air needs to have a good, hard look at itself. But so does the government in dabbling in this type of thing for its own party interests.
I think so, and this reminded me actually of Muldoon and the way that he interfered with TVNZ with the governor.
It's worse than Muldoon because Muldoon, at least he brought in the Official Information Secretary.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 3 tonight. It's been announced that the Crown Minerals Act is being replaced to make it easy to mine. In the same week, Tag Oil boasted that it would turn the East Coast into the Texas of the South. With the arena still self-imploding, are we ready for more exploration? And in a recession, can we afford not to be Phoebe, the downgrade of half of Europe, the slowing of China, and the World Bank today lowering growth forecasts? All point to a far tougher economic time ahead. Isn't the reality that we can't afford to be environmental anymore and it's time to mine and drill, isn't it?
I don't think it is. I mean, I think if you look at China, for example, they announced that they would be spending $1 trillion on green tech, and that's why you've had people like Buffett in there. And I think that they are slightly ahead of the wave, China. But I think this is the attitude of the National Party, and I think that, you know, as we've sort of discussed last year, that this seems to be their only plan is to mine and so on. And their argument is that it is only 0.014% of New Zealand that they're mining. But, you know, I mean, you've got to look at this, and the Texas model, there was the rival competitor, Apache, their spokesperson, talking about this, saying that there was no way that that oil was going to be as easy to get it as Texas. And if you look at Texas, the amount of what do they call them, nodding donkeys that there are is just extraordinary. Like, it would be extraordinary to see the East Coast with that. And I think that they do have to take public opinion into account.
Selwyn, how does the inability to respond to RENA make this a more difficult public relations job for the government?
Well, common sense suggests that New Zealand was not well equipped to deal with a ship on a reef that was close to our coastline, that in an isolated incident where we had the focus of the whole nation on it. What we're talking about here is obviously there is a connect where if something goes wrong out in the deep sea, then you know,
we're not going to be able to respond.
We're not going to. We do not have the hardware. We discussed this on the show when Bernard Hickey was on here, and one of the interesting things that Bernard brought to the argument was that New Zealand has not prepared itself to make sure that if it goes into bed with any multinational that is going to exploit our resource or coastline, or whether it be on terra firma or out in the sea, that it makes a proper and solid and complete contribution to developing the capacity for New Zealand to respond should something go wrong. The problem with this whole thing about this big lure that New Zealand is on the edge of being able to drill into this amazing gold mine of resource, produce the big dollars that's going to be the ultimate saviour, not just for us, but for all of our region. That just is like a wave that overwhelms the sanity of the precautionary arguments that can come out of this. If there's anything that's got to come from this, we need to focus on the nuts and bolts, legislation, regulation. We know from the RENA example that the government doesn't even have legislation that can seek financial recourse from the owners of that ship to an adequate way that we can claim. It's costing you, me, and every other person that's watching this program and everyone else in the country thousands and thousands of dollars probably by the end of this thing. That once it concludes, the government needs to address that. We're not just moaning here. These are real things that need to be done.
Let's wrap the show this week with Phoebe. Your final word, Phoebe.
My final word would have to be on SOPA and PIPA. You might be aware that Wikipedia and a lot of the other major websites like Reddit and so on have blacked out today. I note that there was an interview with some of the representatives for our political parties and stuff.co.nz's technology blog yesterday. No, Amy Adams did not come forward for National to represent their position, but it was quite clear that it's still only Gareth Hughes who understands the kind of remix culture, what Google and all the other big companies are talking about as being untapped economic opportunities that we could nip in the bud through overzealous rights, attention to property rights. And I think that it's an issue for anyone that uses the internet. I mean, to me, the example you would have to look to is that you could get 5 years imprisonment in the United States for uploading Michael Jackson songs, right? Which, as one person on Twitter was saying, that's 1 year more than the doctor that killed him.
Selwyn, your final word this week is?
Let's focus on some of the things that are coming up. The food bill, it's huge. And I think people need to see everything that they're going to digest, all the information there from the point of view of why that is coming into place
Free
now.
trade deal with America.
Free trade, the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. Bomber, if I had an opportunity to debate this on your show again, if it's coming up as an issue, I'd just relish that opportunity.
Well, we'll get you back specifically for that.
Because it's so much in the food bill, and I just say, let's underline that and people just take notice.
Thank you, Selwyn. Thank you, Phoebe. Ladies and gentlemen, to my final word. New Zealand on Air's bewildering self-censorship over the poverty doco galls most by what they chose and what the media now chooses to be offended over. Note, it isn't the abomination of widespread poverty and the social impacts of that poverty that has offended the sensibilities of the chirping pundits and culture managers at New Zealand on Air. It is the supposed embarrassment the poverty doco has caused their political masters that apparently creates the most concern. New Zealand on Air's only concern should be that the doco was journalistically correct, not whether it would embarrass the government. A critical media asks questions and provokes debates on issues we should all feel embarrassed over, and the staggering impact of preventable poverty is a subject that as a society we should all feel intensely ashamed of. By focusing on when it was revealed as opposed to what was revealed, we are creating public broadcasting that breeds denial. If you like tonight's show, please join our Citizen A Facebook site and connect with other like-minded new citizens, and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter and Facebook page. Thanks for watching, whānau. Good night, Aotearoa.
Supporting local content so you can see more of New Zealand on